Alright, so in the first demo that you saw me actually throwing individual, sometimes off of a bat, sometimes off of the wheel. And what we're going to talk about is throwing off the hump a little here too. And the focus of that assignment that you're working on right now is to look at these three basic lids. And there's a variety of different lids outside of what I'm showing you, how you can incorporate them together, something to think about too. So we have the easiest lid, maybe, is the cap lid that I'm showing you. Then the flange lid is a little harder, maybe equally as hard as the gallery type of lid. So I'm going to go over those off the hump really quick here also. Just to show you that, there's different ways to approach how you might actually throw the individual forms. Not always on a bat, not always off the wheel. Then each one has its benefits and possible drawbacks too. So when starting out throwing off the hump, you might want to start with a smaller piece like this. But when you have a larger piece that you've normally been working on, you can slap center it first before you even get it wet. And then when you're centering it, you're not trying to really move that whole ball at once. You might do similar motions that you do with a smaller piece. But you're kind of taking that, as you're centering larger pieces, taking that top and getting it down. And because you're throwing off the hump, you don't have to worry about it too much. You want to get it somewhat centered so the wheel's not shaking, or so your hands don't wobble when they're down here, and also so your eyes aren't getting thrown off. But once you get it somewhat centered, then you can take that top part and you decide about the size of a piece. So if you're thinking about a 2.5 pound piece for, let's say, a teapot, or a jar that's going to be about this big, that kind of size, then you can just center that. And so there's the benefit. Therein lies the benefit of throwing off the hump is I can decide different shapes. So I can throw my lid, body to the jar, all off this piece. So again, back to the fact that it's the same wetness of clay, that's beneficial when things start shrinking. And so your measurements stay true. All right, so I'm going to just go and start with the easiest. And I've talked about calipers and how to measure things with calipers and butterflies and rulers and strings with knots in it, all kinds of things. The tools that you have, that distance can be the interior dimension of that jar, and it can also be then the way the flange is, or the cap lid, or whatever lid you're doing. I'll use a sponge this time instead of calipers. So I'm going to throw it, again, it being kind of the simplest form, thinking about the body, the shape of the body, throwing that up, wondering if I'm going to have a shoulder on it, as I've talked about with cap lids. Maybe the cap sits on a shoulder, maybe it blends into the jar, maybe there's an accentuated shoulder. A little chunk of stuff in there. So I'm just making little jars this time. The ones I made in the first demo were a little larger. Again, what is the scale of that piece you're making? What's it for? Is it a salt cellar? Is it for herbs? How you shape it, is there going to be a spoon? Am I going to pour out of it? Am I going to be able to dip into it with a scoop? There's all these different ways to approach that. So I'm going to measure for the cap lid. I'm going to say, if I'm pouring it, I want that neck to be taller to hold on to the cap. So I'm going to measure it with a sponge just by laying it up there and going like that and saying that's about the diameter. And I'll show you that. So there's the neck. Here's the shoulder. Here's the body. Here's then where the foot is down here, where then I'll be trimming away some. So that neck is pretty tall because I'm saying maybe I'll put a spout on this. And if I'm tipping this little thing over, pouring soy or oil, or if I'm using it in that tipping it over mode, then this neck has to be a little taller to catch that cap lid. So again, I'll measure it again because I've manipulated a little. So remember to use the point off the hump is really important, and I've told you this even off the wheel head, to really dig in there and create that area where you're going to start to define that foot. Off the hump, it's really important because you need to have that wire tool go into somewhat of a notch that is going to wrap around it, and you pull it through. That allows you to actually have a bottom that's easy to trim, okay? Okay, so I'm gonna put this down, put it over here. We'll make the lid now. And again, cap lids can be a variety of shapes. I'll show you some later that are different than this, of course, and the first one I showed you is different than this too. So how you utilize a cap lid, maybe it's a bowl kind of form, maybe it's a cylindrical form, maybe it's a rice jar that then the lid itself is actually a measuring device, and it's a cup. And I use it for measuring the rice, and I pour the rice into that cup, put it in the pan, fill it up with water, put in 2 cups of water, dry it off, put it back on there. So there's different ways to approach the fact that it could be a multifaceted part of the piece. It could be a measuring device. For this one, again, now this is pouring, so I made the opening big enough to be able to fill it easy without using a funnel, but that might be nice too, to have a smaller opening, make a funnel to fill it. And smaller openings might be better if you're tipping it over a lot, like really far to pour. So I'll have to think about the placement of the spout. So off the hump, you don't get compression. Let's go back to the beginning of things about the hump. If you're throwing off the hump, you're not getting as good of a compression as you do. So there's that downfall, again, to the process of throwing off the hump. But I learned from David Shaner and my teacher, Chuck Hines, and I watched Clary Ilian and all these people who affected me very heavily. David Shaner taught me this little thing where I take a ball of clay after I've trimmed it, put it in the center and compress that down, and I've never gotten an S crack. But off the hump, the compression, I like to just bounce my finger in there, and that Chuck Hines used to use a table leg, a little rounded ball leg, piece of wood that he had, and just jam it in there. Goro Suzuki, same thing. It's like how you look at compressing something off the hump is something to actually take into account if you're starting to get a lot of S cracks, okay? All right, so a little cup thing. Again, I'm gonna use my sponge to measure it, get a sense of if I'm close, and I am. Sometimes the angle right here on the lip of it should match the angle of the shoulder so it sits down on there. A lot of different ways to think about what you're doing with it. The lid can be also a platform for some sculptural applications. So I showed you Adrian Sachs's work where he has these lids that then have like an antelope or a gazelle or an impala or a variety of gears, all kinds of things that Adrian Sachs had done with lids. And there's a lot of historic precedent there too. So again, looking at old bronze pieces from Korea, whatever your influences are, historically or in the contemporary sense, you think about the lid in a variety of ways. Is it just a knob like I demonstrated in the first one? Sure. Does it need a knob? Remember, if it's small enough, maybe it doesn't need a knob. Maybe it's all about these forms, and the knob is like just another form that you don't want for some reason. Formal issues are something to tackle. Conceptual issues are something to tackle. And with the feet, with the knob, how it all ties together, these are things that you should be thinking about. And the drawings that you show me and your ideas as we brainstorm over those ideas, there'll be different things that'll come up. All right, so I wouldn't normally do this. I would gently put it over and I would trim it, but just to show you how this one sits, I'll put that on the jar. And, you know, proportions are something to think about. So it seems like proportionately that is maybe too large, but if I take a spout and bring it up a visual proportion, and this is small enough that it's handheld, so if I have that spout over here, this is good enough that I can, after I've trimmed it a little, I can put my hand on it, I can tip it over, and I'll be able to pour something out of it. All right, so basics around cap lids. There's a lot more than the basics. Okay, so the flange lid, when we're looking at that, as I expressed, like you are going to split the lip. So, splitting the lip on the lid is probably the hardest, just like splitting the lip on the gallery, as I told you in the first demo. And again, we can use tools such as the right angle of the rib. We can use our finger. We can make a tool for it. In this one, maybe I'll just use my finger. But first, I'm going to make the body. And deciding the body, shape, all of the things that I discussed with the cap, all of those things can be taken into account. the body's the easiest body in a way. It's just like the calf body. And you would go and pull it up, start thinking about your shape. And again, instead of calipers, I'll use a tool. I'll use my sponge as a dimension. And the circle of my sponge will be the opening, and then it will reflect that profile of the flange that goes into the opening. Okay? So after I've made that form, whatever that form is, I'm going to shape it a little, figure out where that bottom is. I'll give this one a belly here. Following with my interior fingers, pushing against the rib, making the line, drawing that line. Now, when you're looking at it, you have to think about how the flange is going to go into the jar, yes, but you also have to think about this little neck here. Before I define that, I'm going to check that dimension. And yes, my sponge fits down in there nice. Okay, so I'm going to check that dimension, but if I define this neck, keep the curvature on the shoulder, I also have to think of the lip of the lid, that it's not laying on the shoulder of the pot, right? I also have to think about if I want to see this neck, the depth of that, and I'll eliminate that when I demonstrate that. Now, if I want to play with that curvature, I'm going to take a flexible rib, either a metal one or this. If I really want to refine it, get any throwing lines out, and get it into a nice belly that's flowing. Of course, I'm going to trim the belly further from here to the foot rib, but I'm going to use a flexible rib instead of my wooden rib. So shaping, all these different shaping things. I'll do some angular stuff on the next one. Nice and smooth. Again, checking my dimension. My sponge fits down in there really nice. Okay? So every time you touch it, you're going to want to think about checking that dimension, because you might change that dimension. When I refined that neck there and I played with that neck, I changed it. So every time you touch it, you change it. So right here, I'm going to look at that depth, and it's going to be about my fingernails. So I have to think about how deep that lid, the little valley in the lid where the flange comes in. So here's the flange, then there's this valley, and then it goes to the lip of the lid. Again, I'm throwing it upside down, so remember that from the first demo. All right, so let me do that lid. Making that angle so you can cut that off even is, again, pretty important to when you go to trim it. All right, so making the lid is like a bowl with a thick rim. That rim on that bowl will be split to make the actual flange. So I'm going to make the bowl about that dimension I want. I'm going to split that lip about there. I would use my calipers or my sponge maybe before I split it to get an idea of about where to split it. And this is important on a flange. You don't want your flange to be going outward. You want your flange to taper in. So you see how narrow it is here. You want it to taper in or go straight up. You can have the walls on your flange be straight so it fits in there nicely. But if they taper this way, it kind of guides its way into that opening on the jar. Okay. Then I think about that depth that I was discussing. So when I throw the lip up of that lid, I want to think about an area for that neck to be hidden, but not too much, as to the point where it lays on its shoulder. Because when I put this on and I'm glazing it, I want to just leave this area not glazed and down in here not glazed. And then if it's touching the shoulder, that lip will glaze itself on there. So that's a problem a lot. All right, so again, make that pointy part of your rib. Define where the wire tool is going to go. That will aid you in cutting it off flat, like that, so when you go to trim it. All right, so normally I wouldn't do this, but just to show you how it's going to cover that neck, lift that up, and how it's not touching the shoulder. So again, yeah, don't put your lids on. Got to do that after they're leather hard and checking that, and I'd be trimming this. Again, this is small enough. Do I need a knob? But maybe again that's a focal point. And maybe that ties into how I do the feet. Are the feet handled? Are they thrown and trimmed? Parts, you know, are they? Those are things for you to play with and think about. All right? Let's talk about the gallery lid. We're making the gallery lid jar. It's all that same thing that I talked about with the actual flange. But instead of splitting the lip of the bowl for the flange lid, I'm going to have a thick lip for that jar to have its lip split. There's a chunk in here. Let's make a really small little pouring unit. I won't use a sponge this time. Maybe I'll use the diameter of this to say that's the size of the opening. So my rib I'll use to actually split the lip instead of my finger. And I'll also use the rib for the actual measuring device for it. And if it's something that I'm going to pour out of again, I'm going to think about the depth of it so that the lid can get hung up in there. I talked about the curvature in the last one, so on this one I'll try and do some little angles by shaping the form with the rib to make angles. And instead of having a defining neck, I'll just take that lip and I'll split it, and it will be like flowing instead of a shoulder and a neck. So I'm going to use the right angle of that tool. I'm going to push down. Again, I'm going to have that flow in there instead of the defining area. Maybe this little area here will be a good place for a spout to come off, and it'll be a pouring vessel. So I'm going to use this to measure the diameter. So this distance is going to be the distance I need to make the lid that goes down in there. The lid that you make for gallery is a variety of different lids. It could be a bowl, it could be what I'm going to show you. I'm going to throw one with a knob on it. All right, again, I need to have that where I'm maybe trimming a foot, or maybe not. So the wire goes across it nice and flat, right? Right, so I'll make the lid, again, thinking about that dimension. When I'm throwing off the hump, you don't want to have a big piece of clay center. You want to think about the size of the clay at the center. So I'll center it pretty small for this one. And instead of making it upside down, I'm making it right side up. And I'm actually splitting it. I'm not putting a hole in the middle. I'm splitting it over here to start defining that knob. As I mentioned in the first demo, your knobs don't really want to be pyramid kind of shape or a shape that goes like this. They need to kind of flare out a little to actually work so I can grab them. You know, the knob is supposed to be functional. But there are rules that can be broken there. I'm going to measure that again, get a sense. If I was using calipers, I can measure that outside dimension and the inside dimension of that. So I suggest calipers for this. I think it's a lot better tool. All right, again, I wouldn't normally grab it by the knob. I would grab it here and I would put it over on my board and let it stiffen up and trim it. But to show you how it sits down in there, I made it a little bit larger than I should have, but it sits down in there into that gallery area. I'll show you some other examples of the first demonstration, which are at a leather hard stage, and I've trimmed them now. I'm going to go over trimming next. Like, how do you trim some things? And I'm going to talk about that after they get leather hard. Then I'll be ready to go ahead and trim. So I'll have some examples to show you about trimming. Get into trimming, there's several ways to approach it. I like different ways for different forms, but utilizing a chuck, sometimes I'll throw it and let it get leather hard on a plastic bat. Don't use a wood bat because it will warp, but that way with bat pins, I can put it back on anytime and it's centered and ready to hold that piece. But some forms don't really require too much, but if you have the neck and it's really skinny, to try and put it on the wheel, it's like a little top and it can flop around. So look at this piece with the neck and show you. So this was a piece I demoed before, and I already trimmed the lid, and I used the actual gallery on there to hold the lid. I used plastic, like I showed you in the demo. I showed you this already. But if you look at that, that's a chuck that holds it. So because the knob is there, how would I put it on there? So there's a variety of ways. You could lug it up off the wheel. You could make 3 lugs that hold it up there, and that can hold it on there while you're trimming it. And you could do the same thing with something like this. But I don't really like balancing it on this area. I like to use the shoulder because the shoulder can collapse. So this space here that I showed you can be, if I do it at a leather hard stage, and I keep it somewhat leather, I could even trim this if I get to larger ones, but if I get standard with this chuck, I could have it fit right in there. And I showed you that with that gentleman who made the moon jars. He would throw a chuck for the actual jar. So then I'm going to still kind of, before I tap it down, I should have centered it. But usually if I use a chuck, it goes right on the center. The size of your trimming tool, remember the things I talked to you about with trimming too. Since I made this one, I demoed this one for you the other day with this kind of angle on the shoulder. I planned it out as I made it. I told you when you're trimming things, you should try and match the exterior to the interior. So I know where my floor is, and I'm going to try and kind of reiterate what I have going on with the shoulder there. So I like to define the foot first and almost finish off where the floor is before I do this. I like to define that foot. The scale of the foot might be in proportion to the scale of where the gallery is. Then I think about the thickness of that foot rim, and maybe, such as the bowls, where maybe the thickness of your foot that you trim is very similar to the thickness of the rim of the bowl. So that might be a couple ways to think about proportions. Proportional issues can be totally juxtaposed too to one another. It could be a really skinny lip on it and a thick foot. And you have to think about how that would play out in a formal sense. And again, these weren't thrown off the hump, but if it was, that trick I alluded to with David Shaner, I would, after I've trimmed it, take a little ball of clay, put it in there, and throw it against that trimmed surface. And that gives you a compressed kind of skin on there that keeps any S-cracks from starting, or puts a bandage on it, sort of. When I look at the ideas around chucks, you can also bisque fire them and have several chucks to choose from, and then you just put them on the wheel and you center them and you can use them over and over. Now the benefit of this kind of thing is if I had 10 teapots or 10 jars that I needed to trim, they're all similar, I just put it on and use it over and over. I can also work, this is more of a female, where there's this negative shape where it sits down in, holds that shoulder, but you can also do male mold, male chucks that go up into a T-bolt, for instance. So there's different ways to approach chucks. And we'll cover that more when you're making your T-bolts off the hump. So after I trim, I always like to make sure that I think about that surface and smooth off that surface. Utilizing my finger, utilizing a rib, maybe even throwing it. There are times where I'll take that foot, if it's wet, trimming, I can actually throw the foot and get a shape that's thrown rather than trimmed. So different ways to approach trimming. Again, all said and done, when I show you these other examples that I demoed for you with the flange, the gallery, and the cap, you can always think about your vessel on the wheel holding that lid to trim it. So again, your vessel is also a chuck sometimes. Okay, let's review the 3 basic lids I'm asking you to focus on. One is the cap lid. Thinking about that neck. If you're going to tip it over, maybe this is over accentuated, but you're going to tip it over, then it needs to have a distance off the shoulder that catches that. Measurement with that, you're going to be measuring the interior of the lid, and as I showed you with using 2 calipers, you can then measure that with that and measure the exterior area of the neck. And that goes with all of them. Then the next one is that flange. The same thing, measuring the interior of the jar and the exterior of that flange so it fits down in there. The gallery lid, similar issue. You have the gallery, you're going to measure that distance, make that first, and then you're going to match it up to that. If you use two calipers, it usually helps. These I made all with just a sponge. I didn't use calipers, but you know, it works. And remember, if you're thinking about a shape on that you need to, you see that it's pointy in there, that you need to think about matching the exterior to the interior when you're trimming it. So that more pointy shape like that, instead of a curved shape, you have to use some kind of point. And I utilize this in the demo with the rib, and I use the point of it to make that, to talk about different shapes. So outside of throwing, there's interest in hand building the body or hand building the lid. The assignment's about throwing, but if you want to stretch some of those parameters, I've ovalized this one, so it's really oval. Now I could have measured it the same way and thrown a bowl and ovalized the bowl, and it should fit pretty well as like kind of a bowl lid, okay? But for this one, I'm going to talk about slumping into that cavity. When I slump a nice smooth slab into that cavity, I'm going to have it make a mark with the neck. That's where I'll cut, and then I can flip that slump over, and it's got this curvature, and it should sit in there pretty well. Whenever you're dealing with any of your lids, you might think about this idea that I've talked about with the cradle of plastic. With that cradle of plastic, it's a way to keep me from having that lid stick to that gallery when I'm working on it. If I want to look at the fitting for it, I can just lift that cradle with two hands, lift that cradle, and I can pull that lid up without manipulating the lid. So again, just to review, cap lid, flange lid, and gallery lids. Those are your focus. Are there ways to incorporate a cap with a gallery? Sure. If you look at that neck, maybe there would be a cap that would sit over this. And if you look at these different jars that are used for fermentation historically, some of them have two lids. And one might be sealed on, one might be tied on, different ways to approach how they are in transit. So how lids work for the process that that jar is made for, those are ways to think about your lids too. So any questions after this, please don't hesitate. So I've reiterated the demo through this video, but also if you need to see it again in person, please ask me. All right, get to work.